What I want to do is look at some issues in medical ethics. Hardly a day goes by without us seeing on the front pages of our newspapers some new ethical poser presented by new scientific discoveries. Often we English are the culprits for some reason, cloning sheep and doing strange, disquieting things to the essence of nature. How has Islamic law dealt with this kind of thing? Is it, as is sometimes claimed, a static, immobile, medieval phenomenon that can have nothing constructive to say on these things? Well, I'm going to suggest that in fact there have been some interesting arguments, and I'll try briefly to sketch these out for you. Medical ethics, nothing new. The Prophet very much emphasized the importance of a healthy lifestyle. He recommended certain types of sport. He recommended moderation in all things in eating. He also laid down a whole medical code, which Hakim knows a lot about, called prophetic medicine, Tibb an-Nabawi, which uses things like herbal remedies and so forth. Still very important in the Muslim world. The modern world started to disturb this pattern, first of all, 200 or 300 years ago with the introduction of tobacco. Obviously not mentioned in the Quran and the Hadith, so what was the Islamic ruling on tobacco? Was it permissible or forbidden? The fairly important words for these two things are, I'll try and fit them in here. Halal means, not very literate today, halal, and haram, like kosher and non-kosher, permissible, impermissible, pure, impure, lawful, unlawful. So is tobacco halal or is it haram? Well, for many years the jurists thought that there was no problem. And the reason why was that it wasn't prohibited, and the established settled principle of Islamic law is that if something is not explicitly prohibited in the Quran and the Sunnah, it must be regarded as lawful. In the present century, however, researchers have shown that tobacco has very negative health ramifications. And so we find in 1966, the Al-Azhar University in Cairo issuing its first fatwa on the subject. I'll quote to you the text of the fatwa so you'll see how these things are written. Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltutu, who was the head of the Azhar at that time, said, "Tobacco is not intoxicating and does not cause damage to the mind." Remember, Islam prohibits alcohol because it damages, interferes with that which makes us human, namely the intellect. So he says it's not intoxicating, however, it has deleterious effects on the health of both smokers and non-smokers. Doctors have analysed its elements and identified a toxic constituent which ruins the happiness and pleasure of man. Causing damage is, in the view of Islam, an abomination. Furthermore, amounts of money are spent on it, which very often the smoker could use otherwise in more useful and productive directions. For this reason, smoking has aspects which, in the eyes of the Sharia, require that it be prevented and not permitted. This was the first fatwa using this principle of ijtihad, independent reasoning, that prohibited the consumption of tobacco. Muslims still smoke a lot, regrettably, but the Sharia position is really quite clear. The government's position in Egypt was fairly indifferent to this. Their view was that since alcohol, obviously a worse evil than tobacco, since it can lead to violent behavior, is allowed in Egypt because the religious minorities and the tourists want it. So how can we ban tobacco, which is so much less damaging than alcohol? So it's still legal in Egypt, and even in Saudi Arabia. I don't think there's a single Muslim country that bans tobacco.